Welcome to the Ryan Frank Podcast. Ryan is a family man, first and foremost, but he's also a pastor, publisher, and serial entrepreneur. This podcast will help you think, work, and create like never before.
Welcome to the Ryan Frank Podcast. This is Ryan Frank, and I just want to pause and thank you so much for tuning in today. If you are listening on the go, exercising on your commute, or you are watching on your phone or your iPad or your laptop on YouTube, I just want to say thank you so much for your time and encourage you and remind you that you're making a difference. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Hey, can't wait to see you all in just around 3 months. We'll be together, maybe a little less, at the Kids Matter Conference happening September 12th, 13th, and 14th. In Nashville, Tennessee, actually outside of Nashville, Murfreesboro, and we'd love to have you there. We are anticipating over 3,000 people at this year's event, and the Kids Matter Conference is an amazing conference for children's ministry leaders and their teams. So go over to thekidsmatterconference.com, get registered for you and your team. The breakout schedule has been released. We're gonna have over 90 ministry partners, over 200 breakouts, 6 great main stage sessions. Somebody's gonna even win a car. So all the information can be found once again at thekidsmatterconference.com. Super excited about my conversation today that I had with Brandon Hare. Brandon is a pastor. He is also the creator of the Awesome.life, which is a blog and a podcast. Today we talked about the power of stories. You know, we all recognize that stories are powerful, but they're not just great for kids. Of course, kids love stories, but think about it. As adults, we are captivated by a good story. Jesus understood this. This is why he used stories so much when he taught and when he interacted with people. So in today's podcast, we talk about the power of stories, how Jesus used stories, how to use stories to be a better teacher or educator or presenter, how to use stories as a leader. We talk about the church and how churches can better leverage stories to connect with their congregation and their communities, and much, much more. Also, really loved the very end of the podcast where we took a little bit of a rabbit trail and we talked about Starbucks. If you're a coffee drinker, you're going to enjoy the conversation that Brandon and I had toward the end of the podcast about Starbucks and the time that he had managing a Starbucks and some lessons that he learned. Well, it's going to be a great conversation. Thanks again for tuning in. Let's get this show on the road. Here is my conversation with Brandon Hare. Hey, Brandon, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited about the conversation today.
Yeah, well, hey, I'm glad that you're here. Podcast listeners, before we pushed record, Brandon told me he just celebrated his 40th birthday. So happy 40th birthday, Brandon.
I appreciate it.
Yeah,
Thank you.
This is going to be a great decade for you. I've loved my 40s. You get a lot done in your 40s, Lord willing. Go. So I think you'll have a great decade. Hope you had a special birthday. And Brandon, when did we first get acquainted?
Yeah, so we met
at the conference.
Yeah, we met last year at the conference when it was still called MegaCon.
Yes.
And just kind of connected that way. I came to one of your breakout groups. We met, grabbed one of your books, which is awesome. I got the volunteer code, which has been super helpful. So met and kind of chatted about that a little bit, and
that's neat.
It's good times.
Well, Brandon, you have a podcast. I love following your posts on social media. You do a great job. Take a few minutes and tell us about yourself and your family, your ministry journey, what that's looked like and what you're doing today.
Yeah, for sure. My name's Brandon. I serve currently as the next gen pastor in Bellevue, Nebraska at Calvary Christian Church.
Okay.
Married to my wife, Ashley, for 15 years. I got 2 daughters. Riley is just turned 13, which has a whole new adventure lined up, just like entering 40, and she's entering her teen years. And so it's like we're all learning how to figure stuff out. And then we have an 8-year-old named Piper, who I could best describe as a party just looking for a venue. And she's just a lot of fun. So as far as my ministry journey goes, I think it was about my sophomore year of high school when my dad actually decided to get serious about his relationship with Jesus. And so we started going to this church, and it was called Seacoast Church in Charleston, South Carolina. And that's kind of where I did my high school, early adulthood years, and my relationship with the Lord was very like up and down during those years. And so Seacoast was always kind of where I came back to whenever I would get my head on straight for however long it was, And so at some point in my early 20s, right around the time Ashley and I started dating, I started to get serious about my relationship with the Lord as well. And it wasn't like a big thing. It was just kind of like I was showing up consistently, and all of a sudden I was like, oh man, this is the way. Like, this is how we should live. And so I started volunteering. I just did some worship ministry stuff with our youth team at one of our campuses, and eventually got asked to lead that team. So I was just leading worship for doing a volunteer. And then the youth pastor stepped down and got asked to lead the youth ministry there. I went into kind of an internship role from there, and eventually went full time as the youth pastor there. I was there for about 6 years.
How old were you when you stepped into that role?
Let's see. Probably 24, like 24, 23, 24.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, because I've been doing 16 years, and that's easy math from where we're at, right? Good thing about the decade years, they make the math easier.
That is true.
But so I was stepped into youth ministry at that point, and I did that for about 6 years, long enough to see one class start in 6th grade and then graduate. And so I started to kind of wonder what was next at that point, because I felt like my kids had like grown up and left the nest, right? And so I'm like, God, what do you have for me now? And kind of was ready to take a next step. And then I ended up in children's ministry at that point, doing 4th and 5th grade ministry, which wasn't the direction I thought I was going to go. I thought I was going to go like adult ministries, college age ministries, that kind of stuff. But that started what was like a 6-year journey of having no clue what I was doing. Like, I went from that, I went to back into worship ministry for a little while, ended up leaving full-time ministry, working at Starbucks, becoming a store manager at Starbucks. Ended up back in full-time ministry, doing online ministry. And then finally got a call from a friend of mine who was planting a church. It was about 2 years into his church planting journey, and asked me to come join him there. And so went out there, did leadership development for a little while, did creative pastor for a little while. And that 2 years I was raising my own salary, like raising support. And at the end of it, unfortunately, a full-time position just didn't work out. And so I really that was the point for me where I was like, man, if it's been 6 years, 7 years at this point of God just like leading me from one spot to the other, but I felt like wandering in the desert, wondering to myself, like, is he really trying to tell me something else? Like, hey man, maybe this isn't for you. You can't find a spot that sticks. And so I started digging through my own like personal story to try to figure out where was the joy in my life? Like, where was I like actually happy and loving the Lord and really feeling like I was living that abundant life? And where was the fruit? Like, where was I effective? Because some things we love doing, but we're not very good at. And so those two things came together very clearly with Next Generation Ministry, so student ministry. And so I go to my wife and I'm like, I figured it out. I got to go back to youth ministry. And she's like, this was a long 7 years of me waiting for you to say that. I'm like, okay, cool. And so that's when I got connected with Calvary and ended up coming here as a campus youth pastor. Eventually got asked to lead the youth team, and now I get to oversee kids and youth as our next gen pastor. So
so you packed up, you moved states away, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We're originally from Charleston, and it's like 19 hour drive, so we're away.
You are you enjoying your new role?
I really do like it. I think that for me, I didn't think I'd ever be in kids ministry. I was like, man, I really like kids, but I like my kids, and I like kids from a distance, and I think sometimes we get there, but I love it so much. I got a Facebook post from a 2nd grader who was singing me happy birthday yesterday. And I'm like, this is what's, this is the good stuff. So 100%. So I'm loving it.
Love it. Well, we're talking today, Brandon, about the power of stories. This is something that you have a podcast about. Hope that you'll tell us about it at some point. I know, you are passionate about the power of stories. Will you talk to us about that, how your life has been impacted by stories, and why you believe they are just so powerful and inspirational to people.
Yeah, absolutely. So like you said, the podcast is called This Awesome Life. I feel like the whole thing is, I feel like my life is awesome and your life is awesome. And it's not about like status or anything like that, but it's about just recognizing the moments that God has shown up. And the way that we do that is by reliving, like exploring our stories. I personally believe, and I think it's really true, that stories are like, they're the most powerful tool that we have for building relationships and for leading other people. I think that they guide us really well, and they can show us the important things if we're really willing to dig through them. And sometimes that's fun. My blog has kind of the same bent, where I always share a personal story, and then what I learned because of it. Sometimes they're fun, like they're funny. They're times, there's one where I got lost in Sydney, Australia, because I got on the wrong bus. And so I learned a lot through that. But then some of them are painful, about, times when I've dealt with illnesses or dealt with the loss of family members and stuff like that. But both sides of that coin really have the ability to show us what we love, in those moments where I'm like, oh, some people, when they're lost in a foreign country, are terrified. I had a blast. I thought it was so fun. And so maybe something that I value highly is adventure. And, that is one of my personal values. And I found it because of my stories. And then on the same side, we can continue to find new values through the things that aren't as fun, the things that make us angry, or the things that hurt our hearts. Those can point to our values as well. So stories have this incredible ability to point us towards our purpose. Just like I talked about earlier, where I looked through my stories to find where was the joy, where was the fruit, so they can point us to our purpose. They have the ability to guide us toward our values. And I think the most powerful thing is they have the ability to create community. I think a lot of times we tell a story, it starts like this, right? You're never going to believe what happened. And that kind of creates like a separation, right, between me and the audience, where I'm like, clearly you don't know what this is like. Let me tell you the story. But it also draws people in. And so I find more often than not is after that story is done, you'll hear, oh, I've been there. Oh, I've done that. I've done that thing. Me too, and there all of a sudden we created separation, but now all of a sudden we've got connection and commonality and mutual interest. So I just think that those three things right there, purpose, values, and community, man, what a life we can live with just those things, and stories can really help us.
Have you always resonated with stories like since you were a kid, or is this something as an adult that you're like, man, stories are really powerful and like the light switch for you?
Yeah, I think my parents would tell you I've always been a good storyteller. Like whenever what happened to the vase, like I could quickly come up with something. And so I think that my relationship with stories has definitely changed. Like they used to be protective, something that guarded me from everyone else, like kept me out of trouble, kept me from getting into, getting hurt or whatever. But over time, I think that relationship has changed to where they've gone the opposite direction. They used to be something I'd use to keep people away, but now there's something I use to connect with people and draw them in. So I think, yes, they've always resonated with me, but in very, very different ways.
I think I love what you said. That's a great perspective. And, the thing about stories, Brandon, is, kids are captivated by stories, but they're not the only ones that are captivated by stories. Adults, something about stories, a good story. I mean, everybody is captivated by a good story. Absolutely. So before we get into, we're going to kind of unpack some things like, what do we learn about Jesus? I'd love to talk to you about that, because he was a great storyteller, and as communicators and educators, what can we learn about stories? But let's start off, because I know you love to capture stories and curate stories. What's a good story that you've heard lately?
Yeah, this was a fun one, thinking through it. But I think I have a friend that it's a newer friend. We met through a coaching community that we're both in. His name's David, and he's got just an incredible story. He went into the military at 18. Made a couple of bad decisions and ended up on the run from the military, ended up in prison, and spent a couple of years in prison in Kansas City based on all the things that he did. And then worked his way through that, right? Like did the time, if you will. And now on the other side, uses his story to talk about the redemptive power of God. And, just to see where he's at. Cause when I met him, he's this like put together guy who's got a life plan and things figured out. He's doing great work. He's telling people about Jesus. But then to hear this past, if you met him 6 months into this story, you're like, this guy's going nowhere. But now to see where he's at, you can see, man, Jesus intervened in his story in a powerful way, and nobody is beyond redemption. And so I think like lately, that's probably one of the best stories I've heard. And just to hear him share it, you can always tell like, oh, this is real.
Yes.
So,
man, there's nothing like a good redemption story. That's for sure.
Absolutely.
Where you just see or hear of the transformational power of the gospel. Let's talk about Jesus for a minute, because if you read the Gospels, you study the ministry of Jesus.
Absolutely.
He told a lot of stories, didn't he, Brandon?
He did.
Yeah. Any thoughts on what we learned from him on storytelling or the power of stories?
Yeah, absolutely. I think he was the best. He was the best at this whole idea of stories. And I think the reason why was because he knew how to craft a story that would engage the hearts of his listeners, and not just like a specific audience, right? He could tell a story, he could tell one story, and the people that needed encouragement would be encouraged. And at the same time, the people who needed admonishment would be admonished, and the people that needed hope would be filled with hope, all through one story. And, on a practical level, I always look at his parables because they were so specific to the time and place that he was in. He crafted the story so that his listeners would understand. He's talking about farming, he's talking about agriculture, he's talking about fishing, all these things that were very, very common to them. And he understood the culture around him and then leveraged his knowledge of that culture to craft these impactful stories. And I think a lot of times in ministry, we want to keep culture at a distance. Like we want to stay safe in here and let culture do its thing out there. But I think that Jesus taught us that we need to engage culture, be a student of culture, and then be able to speak to that culture in that context. Because when someone feels like them, they're gonna engage with the story more. So if we went out to the town square in Omaha, Nebraska, and I started telling fishing stories, people are like, I don't know what that means. You know what I mean? But now if I start talking about harvesting corn,
they're with you.
People are going to lean in. And so I think that's just study culture and use what you learn so that you can craft impactful stories and really communicate to the people that are listening.
Yeah, boy, that is so good. You're right. He used things that were part of their culture to really drive home spiritual truths. So what can we learn? Brandon, you're a youth pastor, children's pastor. A lot of the people that are watching or listening to the podcast are pastors, teachers.
Yeah.
What's that look like for us? I mean, you hit on it a little bit, that we need to speak into our culture and bring some of that in. But any other thoughts on how we can leverage the power of stories to make us better communicators, whether it's with adults or teenagers or kids?
Yeah. I think stories really make things memorable, right? Like they really make things memorable. I can remember my second grade teacher when she was teaching us like basic math facts. She never was like, just remember 2 + 2 is 4. She would always frame it with something like, hey, there's 2 alligators and 2 crocodiles. How many, you know what I mean? Like how many alligator type animals are there in this and it was way more memorable that way, to visualize like, oh, these alligators and these crocodiles, and now they're and so I think that really that's what we need to do is understand that stories really make teaching memorable. I told one of my blog recently where I called it ruining Christmas, where it was one Christmas, my parents told me, do not wake us up in the morning, because I would always wake up too early. I was 5 years old. They said, do not wake us up. I woke up, I went into the living room and I opened all of my presents and started playing with them, because they just told me not to wake them up. And so I'm like, yeah, I'll just, no problem. But this is why explain it to me like I'm 5 exists, like that's why that's a saying, because if you leave anything ambiguous to a 5-year-old, they're going to use it for their own thing. But I talked about that through the lens of like, in that particular blog post, like words matter, because I've held onto that story for 35 years and I still talk about it to this day. And I've used that story a couple of times when I preach. And there's a handful of my kids who have heard it 2 or 3 times.
Mm.
And now they can tell it to me, like they can tell me the story, and they might not be able to tell me like the 3 points of my sermon. They might not be able to tell me the exact passage that I quoted, but they can tell me that story. And then like, oh yeah, I remember you said we should be careful with our words based on this.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think anytime you can use stories to communicate, what you say is going to be more memorable.
Yeah.
And then at the same time, it's going to be more impactful. I think about anytime you're trying to cast vision, right? Like we can cast vision through stats, or we can cast vision through stories. And we need both. We need both. If we're trying to raise money for hungry kids, we need to know the numbers. We need to know how many kids don't get a hot meal every day. But at the same time, it still feels like it's way over there. Like it's not my problem because it's just numbers. But when I introduce you to a kid whose life has been radically changed because someone said, I'll help with that need, man, everybody's going to lean into that. Like, oh, how can I get involved? How can I help? And so
that's a good
I just think
point.
they make it so much more memorable and so much more impactful.
Yeah. I love that. Yeah. You can, and you're right. You need both. You need statistics and stories.
Yeah.
And really not, both have value, but they both need to be there. Right.
Right. Exactly.
Isn't it crazy how you were talking about like international movements and stuff, but we were talking about this earlier, Brandon, how organizations like Compassion International or Samaritan's Purse or whatever, they're often built on stories.
Yeah.
Some story that people get excited about, that people resonate with, and then they keep building on more stories and they turn into movements. You've seen that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think about like you said, Compassion International. I remember being at the Orange Conference one year, and they come out and they're like, hey, we're Compassion International. And you can kind of see everybody like lean back, or here's the part where they ask us to donate.
Pitch. Yeah.
Yeah. And then out comes an adult who was a compassion kid, who has a story now of like how their life was changed because someone gave up 1 coffee a month. And all of a sudden people lean in and they're like, does anybody want to do that? And hands go up all over 100%. The place. And I would imagine without that story, that percentage is going to be way, way less. Otherwise they wouldn't do it. Right. If they were getting the same numbers either way. So
that's a good point.
I don't know. It makes it more real. Like, oh, I can see an actual human behind what I've done. So.
Yeah. So for those of you that are church leaders, or if you're leading a nonprofit and you're trying to get volunteers, or those of you that are marketplace leaders and you're trying to sell product, I mean, there's just stories have a way of moving people to action. And so remember that the next time you're trying to raise money, you're trying to recruit volunteers, you're trying to get people excited about a project. That the more you can stack those stories up, and the more stories you have in your pocket that you can share, boy, the more powerful you'll be.
Absolutely.
And Brandon, you're right. Going back to educators or teachers, I still remember as a kid in church, some stories that were told, and some my favorite teachers in elementary school. I don't remember a whole lot about what they taught academically, but I remember, of course, the ones that really care for you, and then their stories. And so I remember when I was in college, Brandon, and my youth pastor asked me to teach junior church for a few weeks. And he said, I'll show you how. And he kind of modeled it. And he was great at telling these kids stories. And I remember thinking, like, he would tell stories. Well, when I was a kid, my brother and I did this, and that story would connect with whatever his lesson was. And you tell a good story, and boy, those kids will be on the edge of their seats.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm sure we all know pastors and leaders that are great communicators. And I bet one thing that makes them a great communicator is that they're a great storyteller.
Yeah.
Brandon, let's talk about leaders for a minute and the power. I don't know if you have any other thoughts on just the power that stories can make when you're trying to lead, whether it's I'm leading a youth ministry, or I'm leading all these volunteers, or somebody that has some employees or some people they're trying to lead. Talk to us about the power that stories can play just in day-to-day life for a leader.
Yeah. I think again, it comes back to just making what you're doing more real,
Yeah.
Every week at the church, our all staff meeting, we always start out those meetings talking about one of our key difference makers, which is what we call volunteers. Like, tell us something to celebrate. It's always a story. It's never a number, it's never like, oh, so-and-so at the coffee shop, you really should have seen them. They served X number of cups of coffee. No, we say like, oh, she was at the coffee counter and someone came in. She recognized that they were visibly upset, went and talked to them, helped them deal with the heart. Like, that's the kind of stuff like we talk in stories. And then same when we're talking about wins for the week, it's never like, well, we had 17 people check, I want to get connected to a small group this weekend.
Right.
No, it's like we had a family come in and they haven't been to church since COVID, and it was their first time back, and they're serving on the greeting team next week. That's the kind of stuff. And then when you get stories like that as a leader, when you are able to share stories like that, everyone on staff starts to see themselves in that story as like, oh wait, I had an opportunity. I connected with a family that hadn't been back in a long time. I need to give them a next step next time. What if we did that instead of just saying, oh, it's good to see you. And so all of a sudden it's like, you can teach best practices through new stories without having to be like, all right, here's the 4-step process that we do when someone's coming back from COVID for the first time. Right. It's same with sales, it's same with sales. If you want your sales team to be awesome, then lead through stories, tell these big wins, stuff like that. I just think that a lot of times we think that when we're going to train or raise people up, we have to do it through like the policies and procedures manual. But I think if we do it through stories, again, of like celebrating the things that we want to see, that's when people are really like, oh, I can do that. I can do that.
That's a good point.
So
what would you say, Brandon, to somebody who wants to be a better storyteller? Like maybe someone's watching or listening and they're like, man, you're right. Stories are powerful. They move people to action.
Yeah.
They're a great way to teach. But maybe they don't feel like they're a great storyteller, or they want to be a better storyteller.
Yeah.
Any thoughts for somebody like that?
Yeah. There's a couple. I've been thinking about this one a lot. I've just tried to, there's tons of books out there that will tell you the mechanics of how to tell a story, and they've all got the exposition, and then the rising action, and then the climax, and the falling action, and the resolution, right? Every story should have that. Like, create some tension, take people on a journey. I won't plagiarize a bunch of books right now, but I think that's one thing to look through, of just the mechanics of it. And again, you can find many blogs out there. But at the same time, like, I think for me, what really helped me take that next step in storytelling is the collecting of them. Like, I think we all have those moments where we have this passing thought about something random that happened to us in our life. We were just driving back home from dinner last night, my wife and I, and we were just kind of talking through some things, and she said, it's been a good run. I don't have many regrets. Except for the Jetta. And then I said, and the couscous. And we are just laughing so hard because we bought this, we bought a Jetta one time, a Volkswagen Jetta. It was older. We had no money. We really needed a car. And we had no money before we bought it. And then we had even less money after we bought it, because it kept breaking down. And so we were just laughing about that. And then the couscous, like one night we were really into doing new recipes and stuff like that when we were newly married. So we couldn't like go out to eat a lot and stuff like that. And most of the meals that we made together were really good, except for that one. And it just, I don't know what happened. I've had couscous before. It's delicious. But that night it was real bad. And that was, I don't know, 15 years ago. It was early in our relationship, and we still laugh about the couscous. And so we have these passing moments that it could just end there. Like, that could be a funny story that she and I laugh about, or I can grab that story and be like, you know what, there's something that I can learn from this. And literally I have a spreadsheet in Google Docs There's 107 stories on it right now that are just things that I remember. And I don't know when I'll use them or why I'll use them. But as I look through those stories, I can remember them. And, when I get ready to go write a sermon, I can look through and say, oh, I learned a practical application of this right here. And so just in seeing them, they come to mind a lot, right? Because I see them. And then I remember another detail or another detail.
Yeah.
And so it helps me flesh it out. I think that you don't want to go overboard with it. Like nobody cares what color the Jetta was necessarily, but the fact that it was a mistake. So you don't want to go overboard, but the more descriptive you can be, and stuff like that, really put the people that you're talking to in the story, man, if you'd have been riding in the passenger seat of that thing, like the windows were down because the AC didn't work, we're living in Charleston. So it was 100 degrees and, 90% humidity. So all of a sudden they're feeling, okay, so I got the wind in my face. It's a little bit sweaty.
Yeah.
That kind of stuff puts them in the story and really helps them identify with it.
Yeah, I think that's smart and super practical, Brandon, to start a note on your phone or a Google Doc or something where when you, especially if you're a leader, if you're a teacher, a communicator, where if a story comes to mind, capture it. Because if you don't, if you're anything like me, the next day you'll forget about it. That's right. It's gone. And so when that memory of that story comes to mind, capture it so you don't forget it. I don't think you'll ever regret doing that for sure.
No, I've got stories on that list that I'm certain I'll never use.
But you don't want to forget them, right?
I don't want to forget them. I had a mentor that did that, and that's kind of where I learned the idea from. But she started out before things like Google Docs existed, and so she had multiple 3-ring binders full of just her stories that she had written down or collected, or newspaper clippings from stories that she found inspirational.
That's awesome.
So
Brandon, how, as we start to wrap up the podcast, I'm curious because you're a pastor, you're a church leader. How well do you think we're doing as far as collectively as a church at telling stories? And how do you think we could better tell stories to engage our congregation and communities? Talk to us about that.
Yeah, I'd love to. How are we doing? I think that, I don't think anybody's got it figured out perfectly. We could always be doing better. I think sometimes there's this weird tension when telling stories, right? Like it's about Jesus, right? Yes, it is. But Jesus is the one that's guiding us and leading us and has allowed us to experience those stories so we can bring who we are a little bit more to, whether it's a sermon, whether it's a social media post, whether it's a capital campaign, whatever you're doing. I think we can always be better. I think stories, like I said, stories are what draw people in. And, we see that with Jesus, he told stories and he met needs. And when we do those two things, people are apt to engage with the church.
I think so.
So how can we do it better? I think we just have to share the stories of life change that are coming from within our congregation. And I think we do it on a regular basis. Do you have a family that was on the brink of collapse who came to know Jesus and now all of a sudden they're thriving and they're serving together and they're living a better story? Let's let them tell that story so that other people who are dealing with that think, oh, this is a place that I can go to get help. Share those stories. Not in a manipulative way, because it's easy to say all right, let's parade the kids out there. They'll be cute and whatnot, but really impactful, meaningful things. Especially as I look at things like even capital campaigns or something, you need space. I get it. We all need more space sometimes.
Yeah.
When we tell why we need the space, is it for people that are already here? Or is it for people who are coming? And then is it because we've got families that are growing, want to make a space for their kids? And if it's genuinely that, yes, we want to make space for kids, tell people that. Because when you say when you tell me that this is going to be good for me, I'm great, working out's good for me. I don't nail it all the time. But when you say it's going to be good for my kids, I'm all over that. I'm going to do whatever it is.
That's true.
I take my kids to multiple sports practices a week because they love it and it's good for them and they get the exercise that they need and they get the relationships that they need. I'm not at any of those things.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not personally, right? Like I'm not on a gymnastics team,
Right.
but,
Right.
but for my kids. And so I think that when we are trying to invite people into the story, man, let's make it relevant and let's make it helpful to them.
Yeah.
Same with volunteer recruiting, I think is a big deal. We have a volunteer in our ministry that has now led multiple generations of fifth graders. And so
Oh, wow.
she started 25 years ago at our church.
Mhm.
She had this kid in her small group named Caleb, and
Yeah.
now Caleb's daughter is in her small group right now. And so,
Mhm.
man, we brought her in to share her story at like a vision casting night. I went
Yeah.
up to preach and talk about how we need to get invested in the lives of kids. And people were there, they were like, maybe. And then I showed her story and they're like, sign me up. Not one person left that night without at least taking a step toward what we were doing. So whether it was in front of the scenes, behind the scenes, everybody's like, yep, sign me up.
Yeah.
I want to be part of that. So
That's so cool. Stories are powerful, aren't they?
They really
They
are.
are.
They really are.
They are.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Brandon, this has been such a good discussion. I'm curious, Brandon, when you think of is there a pastor or author or communicator that comes to mind that like, I love listening to this person because they're great with stories?
Yeah. Actually, I've been thinking about this one too, because even up to this moment, I was like, I don't know. But when you added author, it was like, okay, yes, I know. If everyone is familiar with Bob Goff, like that guy is a master storyteller.
Yes, he is.
I don't read his books because I want to listen to them. He reads his own books on audio. I really feel like when I listen to his books, I get way more out of them than when I read them because I hear his voice in it. He draws me into the story. I feel like I'm there when he talks about landing this plane on this little lake so that he can go, meet with this friend of his. I'm like, okay, yeah, I could see that, I can feel
100%.
the turbulence and stuff like that.
Yeah.
He's a master. So just reading his stuff has been really helpful.
He's one of my favorites. He's so inspiring.
Yeah.
And man, just loves people, doesn't he?
And he gives you the gospel in a way that's super, super accessible. Like whether you've never heard of Jesus before, he makes Jesus feel so familiar that I feel like I'm actually able to get to know this Jesus guy as opposed to relate to him from a distance.
Yeah. And man, isn't that something that we should all desire?
Oh, absolutely.
In our own lives.
Absolutely.
So find some, whether it's Bob Goff or Charles Swindoll or whoever that person, that Max Lucado, whoever that author, pastor, influencer, communicator, that just is great at telling stories. And man, just pray, God, would you help me learn from those people? God, would you help me in my context to be that kind of a communicator? Because those people have a powerful way with people for sure.
Yeah, for sure. And then I would just add, sorry to interrupt. I would just add that like practice them. Tell your stories. Don't just put them on the spreadsheet. Actually find time to sit down with somebody and say, hey, can I run this by you? Because I think that reading Bob Goff or Charles Swindoll or all those people are great, but you still need to figure out your own voice. Like I think Bob Goff is an incredible storyteller, but I'm not aspiring to be him. Like, let me learn from him.
Yes.
But with my stories and my voice and my life experience, so
100%.
Just add that a little bit.
So Brandon, take 60 seconds and tell us about your podcast and what your goal is with the podcast, what it looks like.
Yeah, for sure. So I have a website. It's called This Awesome Life. You can find it at thisawesome.life. And basically there's two kind of facets to it. One is the blog and one's the podcast.
Okay.
And so I say that This Awesome Life is a collection of stories that point to purpose. Like that's the whole goal. I want to help people figure out what their purpose is. On the blog side of things, that's me. Like it's my stories. I invite a guest post every now and again, but mostly it's just me telling my stories and what I've learned from them.
Okay.
The podcast is where I invite other people into that conversation. And so I have a conversation with somebody, I hear one of their stories, and then we kind of dig into that together. Excited about the episode of yours that's coming out.
Me too.
In the future. It was a really good conversation, but so the podcast, I just get an opportunity to sit down with somebody hear a little bit about their story. And we literally talk through like, okay, what'd you learn from that? How are you doing with that these days? How can we apply that to our lives? And I've had a lot of fun with it. It's so it launches, or I guess it launched Monday, May 22nd will be the first episode. So
That's
I'm sure this
awesome.
is after that.
Okay. Yeah.
And
it would be. Yep.
yeah. So I'm excited about those episodes starting to run, and man, really looking forward to what God does with it.
Congratulations. I know God's going to do great things.
Yeah.
So Brandon, I always like to end the podcast by asking 2 questions. First, I'd love to hear from you. What's your favorite Bible story out of all of them? There's a lot of them. What's your favorite, and what makes it your favorite?
Yeah. I always come back. I think I go through seasons of when it like drifts, but I always come back to Nehemiah. Like it doesn't, normally if someone's like, what's your favorite? That's the first thought. And then I'm like, is it still? Yeah. Yes, it is. So it's that one. I could share a couple others that are really high on the list, but man, what a leader, what a guy that just showed up when he was needed. And I think one of the most amazing things about Nehemiah starts off right at the very beginning when it says that the king had never seen him sad. And we look at like, this guy's never had a bad day at work. What's that like? Doesn't say that.
That's true.
It just says that Nehemiah did a good job of being all in. And it starts with that. And you see that all in character go throughout. And he just made his whole mission so personal to every person that was helping. He set them up in families so that they could work together with their families. And then when opposition came, they were fighting for their families. They're not fighting for a wall. We're building a wall, but that's not what we're fighting for. We're fighting for our families. We're fighting for the next generation. And I felt like, man, he just led so well through all of that. And just help people see what's important. So I think that's the one I come back to.
It's a good story. It's an inspiring one. I'm with you on that. All right. And the last question, what is something big that Brandon is working on right now? Is it the podcast? You just talked about the podcast. I know that's
it's that, but I also have a book coming out this late this summer. So looking at like later August, early September. It's called Magic in the Mug. It's very much a book about purpose, but it goes through the lens of how coffee is made, which it's fun. So we start out with
that's neat.
We start out with like clearing the fields and prepping it. And so for our lives, we've got to clear things out of the way. We've got to clear out sometimes bad things that, bad habits or whatever, but sometimes we've got to clear out good things to make room for great things. And we go through the whole process of like planting. What does it look like to plant something in your life? Harvesting. What does it look like to do things the right way? Take the whole process and get to the end and kind of talk through like, all right, you've done all these things. Now you get that first sip. So what does it look like to really move forward in all of the things that God's calling you to? So I'm really, really excited about that coming out.
Well, congratulations. That's neat.
Thanks.
So how far along are you in the process?
Manuscript is done. It's been edited. It's my wife does all of my graphics and stuff. She has a business doing graphic design. And so she is working on getting the layout done now.
Man, that's awesome. You're pretty far along.
I'm really excited about it.
Magic in the mug.
Magic in the mug.
So are you a coffee drinker?
I am. Okay. So I worked at Starbucks for 4 years.
That's right.
I was part-time kind of doing the side hustle thing when I was a broke youth pastor. And that went really well. I love customer service too. And so it was just a fun time. And then I went part-time at the church for a while and was a store manager there. So learned a lot about the process. Done some things like that. So it was one of those things I was writing. That book was actually born out of one blog post where I just wrote this blog post about espresso. And I was like, man, I can do this with every face. So
I bet. And it just started to come together and click in your head. So what was it like working at Starbucks? Did you like it?
I did. It was a different time. It was a couple years ago when it was, early in the like, there weren't a lot of drive-throughs yet and things like that. So it really was still small town coffee shop feel. It's probably different now. I mean, at least on the customer side of it, it looks different, but back then it was a lot of fun. I worked with some great people. I felt like I was an okay leader before I started working at Starbucks, but I learned so many really practical leadership lessons in moving up through that company. I had a couple of really good store managers that really poured a lot into me and led me really well and saw potential in me and helped me get where they thought I could go.
And that's awesome. That's awesome. Yeah, because I was going to ask you, like, why do you feel like you, and this is a bit of a rabbit trail and we'll wrap up, but why do you feel like you grew so much? Is it because I was going to ask you before you mentioned those managers, was it because they had a great training program? Is it because you just you were in the trenches and you figured it out? Or do you really feel like it's because you had some leaders that really walked beside you and helped you?
It was probably a combination of the three. I mean, Starbucks has really good training materials, like they know exactly what they need you to learn. And things like that. But both of them were just really good situational leaders. They saw where my blind spots or my weak spots were, and they would come alongside me and help me. I wasn't great at managing conflict at that time. I was kind of a passive aggressive, that kind of person. And I had one store manager that was really not about it. So she would literally take me and the other person who we both had the same issue. So when they came together, we were really good at being passive aggressive with each other. And she would literally walk on the floor and bring us to the back room and be like, you two, you said this, talk it out. And I'm like, okay. And so I got really good at having those kind of conversations. And she would tell us all the time, like, just because you disagree with one another does not mean that you don't like each other. Just like work it out. That's and point. When you get constructive feedback, it's not an attack on you. It is helping you get better. Like, we want the best for each other. Go into it knowing that. And I'm like, that's a very different conversation. Like, let me help you grow. Can you help me? And I think that was one of the practical things that
100%
you really leaned into.
Yeah. That's helped you be the leader that you are today.
Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's Brandon Hare. Brandon, thank you so much. Go check out the awesome.life. Congratulations on the new podcast, on the book that's coming out. And Brandon, you're going to be leading a breakout at the Kids Matter conference this fall.
I am. I'm so excited about it. Can't wait.
Those of you attending the Kids Matter conference, you can meet Brandon in person. Brandon, thanks so much. This has been a fun conversation. Keep up the great work.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks for the invite.
Yep.
This episode of the Ryan Frank podcast has ended, but be sure to subscribe for more conversations to help you stay on the leading edge. And if you like what you've heard, please rate this podcast with 5 stars. Thanks so much, and we will talk to you next time.